Hi everybody, it's Kristoffer Lawson here. Bit about my own background. I come from a long history of technology. I started coding when I was 7. I grew up in Northern Ireland, if you're wondering about the accent. And always been very fascinated about how to apply technology to do great entrepreneurship and sort of build great businesses. A couple of my previous companies were Holvi, which maybe some of you know, which is a banking company, which ended up being sold to BBVA. We did a very different approach to banking. Then I was working on Solu, which was a very radical approach to computing, and I'll maybe share a couple of words about that. And currently building something called Attractive.ai, which is basically a bot that can analyze your website and your user experience and your usability without any users whatsoever. And you can try that one for free. I'll tell you a little bit about that as well, Attractive.ai. But here I was invited to talk about building MVPs, and having been involved with many startups and built a few companies myself, then maybe there's a few lessons to share with you guys around that. But at the same time, feel free to ask any questions about building a startup or entrepreneurship in general, seeing as I've done a lot of that. And I have reserved a fair bit of time for questions. We were just discussing that I was giving a lecture on usability a couple of weeks back at Access, which is the other entrepreneurship society. They ask lots of questions. So if you guys don't come up with any questions, then you're going to be the losers. So today I wanted to talk about MVP and specifically how to be lazy. I mean, the whole point of doing an MVP, a minimum viable product, is you want to find lessons as quickly as possible with the least amount of effort. This is something that, of course, one of the great sort of heads of the MVP type of movement is Eric Ries, and how he talks about how they built this, for instance, the IMVU service, and how they learned those lessons after only 6 months of building something. So very typically what companies do is they build up this fantastic product, and then after they've built this great technology and great product, then they learn that they're doing something radically and fundamentally wrong. So how can we shortcut those lessons and learn as quickly as possible? Now, MVP has become, rightly or wrongly, a bit of a fashionable word in the startup ecosystem. And I feel it's important to go back to looking at what the acronym actually stands for. So minimum viable product. And today I'm actually going to talk about not just one topic, but 3 topics. So this acronym has 3 things, and most startups only focus on one, the minimum part of it. Whereas you should also be thinking about what is a viable product. We'll look at a couple of those. But it's very easy to build a minimal product, something that barely showcases the technology or the idea. It's a lot more difficult to build something that's actually then viable and connects with people. Having said that, I have to say that many startups that I've coached have even forgotten about the minimum side of things, or the minimal. I will share kind of the birth story of Holvi, which, as I mentioned, it's a banking service. And if you go back to the very early sort of history of Holvi, it was actually a little terminal script that I wrote. I named it after my online nick, which was Setox, so I called it Setox Credit, which was all about just tracking our expenses with a group of people. And this I wrote in, actually, believe it or not, I think in C, and it was very rudimental. You could just run it on a laptop. Pure text-based. It was never meant to be something that would become, a great online success. This was very much a minimal product. It It wasn't a product that was viable. Wasn't something that you could pitch to investors. But the fact that we had built this, and we saw that people were interested in just using it, just our friends were using it to sort of share expenses and track stuff. We thought, okay, maybe there's something to this that we could start to build. And long story short, we went through a couple of phases with that. And we started to think about, in the broader sense, what is it that people do around money that's social? So any kind of grouping of people and money. And at the same time, I was organizing this digital art festival, the Alt Party. And Tuomas, my co-founder in Holvi, was the unfortunate treasurer for that particular event. And we were trying to think, how to optimize that, because it was always so much effort to deal with money. So then we started working on a version of this, which ended up being a little bit more like this, where you could manage your money as a group, as an association. And we didn't make a lot of noise about this, because one of the lessons that we learned very early on was how important the design and the branding of services like this are. But we built this, we started sort of playing around with it. People seemed to be more interested in this new approach. Investors seemed to be more interested. And the feedback that we were getting, though, was that the design of this product was not super appealing. The branding was not super appealing. So I remember I did this trip around the Nordics, and I came back and had a deep discussion with Tuomas about maybe thinking about a completely new name for the product and effectively relaunching what we had already built. Somebody mentioned that we did like a 360-degree pivot. So we built basically the same thing, but with a different brand and a different approach. But that was important feedback that we were learning, I think, not quickly enough, but we were learning that, okay, there is something to this idea which maybe might appeal. And this was a minimal product. I mean, it worked, it had the functions, but it wasn't a viable product. This was not something that was going to appeal to people. It didn't have the sexiness to it. So we had to go back to basics to build something which was actually viable. One way to sort of shortcut a lot of these learnings is to not build anything at all, but to actually test if something is a good idea by talking to people. And indeed, this is something that I've seen happen time and time again when, for instance, this alt party that I was mentioning, the way that it actually started as an event was that I talked to a couple of people about doing an event like this, and they were like, yeah, I want to be on board to help organize it. And I didn't have there was no event location, there was no organizing team, but just the fact that people got excited about it became something that kind of connected and that then happened. We did similar things with kind of the early versions of Holvi, where we were kind of talking to, actually Slush was built on an early version of Holvi before it was even called Holvi. Slush was then like 300 people. So the fact that, very early on, before we even really had a product, then people started to get kind of, I wouldn't say excited, but interested at least, and they wanted us to take it further. Another great example is I did this tour of the Nordics. This was in 2010, where I visited every single university city in the Nordics with a Land Rover Defender in the winter, including Iceland, by the way. And it started out as one of those things where I thought, whenever we get a nice big exit from, at the time, Skred, then this would be something that I could then do. And I told a friend about this idea, and he said, well, okay, well, why don't you do it now? And I said, well, this requires a lot of capital. I don't have the time right now. And he suggested then, well, okay, why not talk to some sponsors about this? And I was like, yeah, you know what? What's the worst that could happen? The sponsors will say no, of course they will. but I haven't lost anything. So I went to talk to Nokia and I went to talk to Microsoft. And I remember the Microsoft meeting was such a typical kind of Finnish meeting where I had this fantastic keynote presentation about this tour, about the Land Rover, about the people and what we would be writing about. And the people in the room, there were typical Finnish people, not one expression between them. They were like, so I thought, okay, I blew it. It was like, yeah, worth a shot. Then the next day, I got an email saying that they were really excited about the product or about the project. So, and they wanted to become, I think, a diamond level sponsor for that. So I was like, holy crap, now I actually need to do this. So I think that's a great way to test an idea is like, start selling it, start getting people connected, and if they're interested, and then, well, hell, then you have to start working on it. The design, as I mentioned, was a key part in moving away from the minimal product to something that actually became kind of viable. And the first thing we did whenever with Tuomas, we started kind of effectively sort of pivoting the company towards this Holvi thing. And the first thing we did was we hired a designer. And probably the best decision we made lots of stupid decisions, but that was one of the good decisions. And we got invited to pitch at one event organized by Seed Camp, which is this London-based investor, where there were a bunch of other startups as well. And the other startups had nice little prototypes and all kinds of stuff built out. We had basically nothing. I mean, they knew that we knew how to code, but we didn't have any kind of actually functional product. But Mikko, the designer, started working on some designs, like the one that I'm showing you here. This is not from an actual product. These were just mock-ups. And by the way, very few people have seen these. So these are kind of like the first version of Holvi, which was never implemented in code. But they looked convincing. They looked like screenshots of a real product. So the investors were like, yeah, so you guys are building a new bank, right? Like, yeah. And they were quite excited about this. So they decided to invest. And I think that's a great test of kind of the minimum viability of a product. I mean, you come up with these screenshots of what the product looks like, a really nice design, and people want to invest in you at that point already. But I think the design here played a key part, and I think many startups don't focus on that enough. In the very early days, thinking about the user experience, the design, and how to make it stand out from all the other hundreds of products and companies out there. So this is historically interesting stuff. This was a key design that we used when we pitched to many investors in London and so forth. And again, this did not exist. We eventually did create this in code as well. It was quite a fair bit of work, but we did eventually create that. It was still missing many of the features that are shown in this design, even towards the end of the Holvi sort of experience. But it was enough. It was something that investors could understand, customers could understand. And then they started to buy into what we were doing and become kind of part of our fans, so to speak. So I think that was very key, and I think that was key to what led us to become somewhat of a success and to get that exit out of the company as well, having those connections with the fintech scene. Now, going back a bit, so the sort of the minimum viable product kind of thing. What many startups do is they take an existing idea, or they've come up with their idea independently, and they realize that there are others in the market doing it already. So what they end up doing is creating basically the same product as their competitor, but either more cheap or in some other way just like a very pale clone of the original. And we were talking about martial arts there with Anno, and if you're going up, you're going into a fight with a pro. You need to have a kind of battle plan. If you just go in there and say, like, well, I'm going to be the cheaper version of that, well, that's not really going to work in the fight. At the end of the day, they're just going to murder you. And of course, we struggled with all of my companies are kind of like that. I like going into places where there are big players. I mean, with Solu, we were going up against Google and Microsoft and Apple. So I like going in there and sort of thinking different. But if you go in there trying to do what they're doing, that's just never going to work. So you need to come up with something that is unique about your product, something that stands out. And maybe you don't even do half of the stuff that your opponent is doing. So maybe you can't do these amazing takedowns or kicks, but maybe you come in with a sharp katana, and that kind of levels the playing field, actually more than levels. So think really carefully about what is maybe the one or two kind of features or aspects of your product that make it substantially different, that you're not actually even on the same, you're not playing the same fight. I remember also there's this quote or story, I think it was from Musashi, the famous swordsman in Japanese history, where he was going to go up against somebody who had a naginata, which is basically a long kind of staff with a sword on the end. And generally, swords fighters are at a huge disadvantage in that situation. The naginata has much, much bigger reach. So it was probably a mixture of different things, that he probably arrived late and annoyed everybody. And then when the fight was supposed to start, there was, you would bow to show respect, or that was the idea. But he just walked in and then cut the head of the opponent. No bowing, no respect, kind of at all. So throughout Musashi's life, you see these little sort of anecdotes and stories of how he beat his opponents. And it's not because he was a great swordsman, probably was reasonably good, but because he played a better strategy. He didn't play their game. He played a different game. And of course, that pissed many people off, but, he lived, they didn't. With Solu, which was our very new operating system, we had exactly that problem again. It's like we were building an operating system that is about collaboration, about sharing, about using the cloud in a very efficient way that had never been done before, and with a very radical new user interface. But at the same time, I mean, we're talking about building an operating system. So how do we match everything that all the other guys have done? I mean, if you had to build everything from scratch, things like printer drivers and stuff, that would have been just a never-ending battle. We would never have even had the smallest of chance. I know, don't get me wrong, this was a huge challenge anyway. But what we did quite smart was that we took Android as the base of the operating system. So we got all the boring stuff from Android automatically, even though we changed the whole user interface and the whole application model completely. But it meant that we could take care of the boring stuff. And also we could have things like Microsoft Word running. Now, there's probably an argument to be made. I mean, we spent a lot of effort even then, and there's probably an argument to be made that ultimately this, by the way, was not a successful company. I mean, we raised several million euros, but it didn't ultimately fly. And maybe again, if you go back to it, it's like, okay, well, we were still maybe playing their game, so we were still going up competing directly with the Apple Macintosh or even the Chromebook to some respect, in some respect. But is there a way that we could have played into a different sector, which would make the whole competition irrelevant? And we also made, by the way, our own hardware as well, so that added extra complexity. So again, is there a way that we could have bypassed that? Maybe, but it was not an easy challenge at all. But at least we made I think that was one of the great decisions that we made, that we took Android as the core, and based everything around that. So again, if you're thinking about your own products, is there something that you can use that's already there for free that you can build your base on, and then you can add your uniqueness on top of that? Now, MVP, it's three things. It's like the minimum viable product. So many startups then don't think about their product. They just build something that's flaky and barely keeps together. But you do need to think about how to portray it as an actual product, as something that is gift wrapped for the customers. And that means, well, the design that we talked about before, but also how you communicate and who do you communicate to. And people just don't really think about this enough. One exercise that you can do is think about the target audience that you have, and think about it in very specific terms. So one thing that I like doing is that we design a person, a fictional person, but we give them an actual name and where they live, what street do they live on, what type of hobbies do they have, what kind of films do they go and watch, what music do they listen to. So we get very, very, very specific about that type of person. And that helps us make it feel more real. So instead of just having this sort of abstract thing like marketeers, then we get more specific about what their age group is and how do they work and where do they go to find information about products. So really, really thinking down on that level. Each person is very different. So that, I think, will help you frame the way that you communicate about your product to the outside world. Also, many startups, it's amazing how frequently this happens. And I do this myself, even though I preach it, is when you build up your kind of front page, your landing page for your startup, it's incredibly overly complex and very vague. You go into these sort of lofty ideas of how you're changing the world and so forth, which is great, by the way. I mean, your startup should absolutely change the world. But they don't actually tell you what you do or what they do. And so you arrive on their website and you spend like half a minute, by the way, which is a long time, and I'm trying to figure out what they do. I can't understand it. And if I don't get it within that time frame, I'm off. And most people won't even bother that long. So really try to narrow down the message to not to the point that they can understand everything about what they do, but enough so they go like, okay, that's kind of interesting. Can you tell me a little bit more? And then you can kind of open it up and let them try out the product and learn more and answer their questions. We have a good habit of faking it until you make it. So with back in the days of Holvi, for the first, I think, 6 months at least, if not longer, when people went to the service and pressed pay, and to make a payment as if they were in a bank. What would happen was that Tuomas would get a message or see the message that a payment was made, and he would log into our partner bank, which was Nordea, and make the payment for them. And for the first 6 months or so, nobody cared. I mean, it worked fine. It looked like something was happening whenever you hit the button, but we just did it manually. And this is great. I mean, like, I can't believe how many startups I've talked to where, they have some great AI component or some great analysis thing, and they're like, well, why not just do it manually until you have your first dozen or so customers or 100 customers. X.ai is another great one, which I use myself. It's basically an AI service that can book meetings for you. So it's basically your, kind of your personal assistant for your calendar. And in the early days, it was really fantastic because you would see all the VCs were using it and raving about it, how amazing it is. And you could just send EMA, which was the AI, you could send her a message saying, okay, I'd like to meet, at so-and-so. These are the dates that are available. And she would come back with different suggestions, and it was just amazing how he could understand my language that well for an AI service. It was fantastic. And I did start to get a little bit suspicious. So I was in New York at the same time as the founder, and went to have a chat with the guy. And I kind of pressed him on this, like, yeah, your natural language processing is pretty damn good. I mean, how do you do that? What type of technology? And yeah, he was a bit vague about it until he revealed that it was, fake it till you make it. So they had a bunch of people basically responding to the emails. And there was some element of technology analyzing the times and so forth, but the main component of that service was completely faked. But hey, the VCs loved it, the business took off, and now they actually do have an AI that kind of sort of functions in that way, but never as good as the old humans. With Attractive, we did something very similar. So in the very early days, we didn't even really have a bot that would analyze the UX. It does exist there now, but we would talk to customers. We would present this idea of a bot that can look at the UX and give you hints and tips for how to improve the website. And what we did is that we just had UX people, so actually UX reviewers and experts, kind of just analyze it and create the slides. As time went by, the technology got better and better, so we can do that less and less and less and less. But again, customers didn't really care. I mean, like, they paid for something and they got a result, and they were pretty happy with that result. So, why not? They don't care about the technology that you use at the core. One place to go to analyze your thoughts about MVP is if you look up online, you should be able to find this MVP analysis by Eric Ries. So there are kind of key questions that you can ask yourself, and you can go through and fill in this template about your customers and what your value proposition is. So don't forget that you need to have that clear, unique selling point. You need to have your value proposition for it to be a viable product and not just a minimum product. The best way to know is if people give you money. So it's good for early signals to ask people, see what they think. But the problem is whenever you ask friends, at least if you ask it in the wrong way, they will say, yeah, that's probably a good idea. Yeah, you should go for it. Or even customers, like, would you like us to do this? And like, yeah. And customers will always say yes to everything. It's like, yeah, if we add this feature, would that be good? Yeah. And sometimes even they will give you suggestions like, yeah, you should totally do this. This would be great. And then you ask them, well, okay, so if we're going to release this feature then next week, and just for you, would you be happy to pay for that, 500 euros? And they're like, no, not really. It's not really a feature for us, but I think it would be a great feature, but just not for us. I mean, for those other guys, I think it would be really great. And you hear this all the time. So fundamentally, the way they get the real answers is to get them to pay. So sell something. As I said, fake it till you make it. Sell something. Do all the work by hand and deliver the customer something. And get them to pay. So again, this is what we did with Attractive. We didn't even have we started by looking at, okay, we need to build this dashboard that customers could interact with because, it's a SaaS service, so we should have a dashboard. But the problem is that if you have a dashboard, then you need to actually have some code that works, which would be a lot of work. So what we did instead was that we decided that our product was going to be a PDF that we would send them. And that meant that we didn't have to create a dashboard. We didn't have to go through all that coding effort. And actually, the PDF for many customers is better than the dashboard. They can share easily. And it could be done by hand. So again, you can also tweak what you think your product is based on the idea that how could we do something which requires no code whatsoever and that they will pay for. And once they start paying for it, then well, at least We don't yet know if it's going to be like $1 billion business or it's going to scale mightily, but at least somebody is willing to pay something for it. That's a pretty damn good start. So ultimately, think about how to do the least amount of work possible. And it's very difficult for coders because we love to do all kinds of lovely technological solutions. Go out there, talk to people, find out as much as you can, and get them to pay. That's the only way that you can actually know. And there's a saying in Finnish, mene ja tiedä, and I think that's fantastic. We were actually at this gig, Aavikko gig, a couple of nights ago. Aavikko is a Finnish electronic band, and they have a track called Go and Know. And that kind of described that mentality perfectly. It's like, well, big or slow, go and know. So just go and find out and learn those lessons as quickly as possible. Don't sit around pondering. It's best to just do stuff. Thank you. Any questions from the... we need one question from somebody. You'll have to conjure up some kind of question. What is my favorite color? Maybe the cameraman could come up with a question.
I can ask something.
Yes, let's get one question.
Where did you find the courage to go forward, even though it wasn't always easy? I think this is a general entrepreneurship question, but it also applies to this.
Can they hear that question, or should I repeat it? Okay, yes. Fundamentally, the reason I'm an entrepreneur is because the alternative sucks so much. So I have done project work and so forth at corporate environments, and the realization of how much that environment sucks with their sort of bureaucracy and their branding nonsense and the slow mechanisms and politics of the machine, that's enough to make me go, like, I never want to do that ever again. And no matter how much entrepreneurship sucks, and it really does. I mean, like, all of our companies have been, at the brink of death multiple times. It sucks so much, and whenever a customer says no, it's like it's the worst feeling in the world. And many tears have been shed, but it's still better than a life of meaningless, nothingness. That's what kind of keeps me going. And I'm mortally afraid of dying, not because of the death itself, but because I haven't achieved everything that I want to achieve. I haven't done enough stuff. So I really want to I don't want this life to be worthless. And that's kind of what keeps me going. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Any more questions, or are we roughly good? Okay. Send me an email at this address. We can also arrange, if anybody is working on a concept at Metropolia, we can arrange some free access with Attractive to do some runs of the user interface. So we can do that. Just send me an email and mention Metropolia. And then, of course, you can follow me on Twitter as well. Okay, thank you very much.